Hey y'all, it's me, Kevvie. Today is Transgender Day of Visibility, and tomorrow is the first day of Trans Girl April. So I wanted to make a video looking at trans visibility in books, with a focus on the 2004 novel Luna by Julianne Peters. My roommate encouraged me to read this book, as it was the first trans representation she had ever seen. It was required reading in her high school. And she was thrilled with the representation at the time, but thought it would be an excellent foil to the books we'll be reading throughout the readathon. So we're going to take a look at this book, why it was important in its day, why it no longer works, and how trans representation has changed since its release. Also, real quick, I wanted to acknowledge that while I was reading this book, the author, Julianne Peters, passed away. I'm especially glad that I'm discussing this book now, so that her legacy is not forgotten. Luna was the very first YA novel featuring a trans character published by a mainstream publisher. That is huge. It was also a National Book Award finalist. I don't know that award, but I'm sure it's probably a big deal too. Luna tells the story of a closeted trans girl in high school who is only out to her sister Reagan. We follow Luna as she learns more about her identity and her desperation to come out and live as her authentic self, and the fear that holds her back. It has its beautiful moments and its heartbreaking moments, and for the most part, I didn't hate it. When Luna was published in 2004, there were very few trans books on the market, especially ones by trans authors. So despite this book being written by a cis woman, young trans people at the time were able to read this and feel seen and validated and understood. And I'm sure that must have changed lives. I was truly impressed by some of the references in this book. Hedwig and the Angry Inch is pretty well known at this point, but it was a lot more underground back then. And the Abbé de Choisy is such a deep cut that I've never known a single other person, trans or otherwise, who has read or even heard of her. The Abbé de Choisy wrote the Transvestite Memoirs about her life as a trans woman in the 1600s. So clearly Peters had done her research before writing this book. While reading Luna, I reflected a lot on my own childhood, specifically during the scene when Luna tried to go to school as herself. I started to wonder what it would have been like to go to school wearing a dress. And then I remembered I had. If y'all are new here, you may not have heard this story before, but in my junior year of high school, I made a silly YouTube video lip-syncing to Lady Gaga's song Christmas Tree, wearing one of those sexy elf Halloween costumes. The video went super viral, amassing over 2,000 views in only the 12 days that it was online. But then I got death threats at school. One day the entire locker room was chanting, "Lady Gaga, faggot." It was really fucking scary. And I was eventually forced to take down the video, and I was told I was never allowed to cross-dress again, preventing me from figuring out my gender identity for another several years. When I finally began my transition, I re-uploaded the video in order to reclaim that part of me that was silenced. I'll have it linked if you want to see baby Kevvie. Anyway, I recorded the Christmas tree video in October, but didn't release it till November. In between then was Halloween, and because I already had this Halloween costume, I wanted to wear it to school. Obviously, this dress was way inappropriate for school, but it was the only one I had. My parents gave me permission to wear it, however, I had to butch it up as much as possible. They made me wear a baggy sweatshirt and sweatpants underneath it, in this hideous, ugly shade of green and gray, making me this shapeless, genderless, frumpy atrocity. So even then, I wasn't really able to wear a dress. And it was so deflating to get really close to being able to express myself, but still being stuck on the wrong side of that wall. So yeah, reading this book reminded me of a lot of that stuff from childhood. However, because this book was written by a cisgender woman, there are a lot of things this author does wrong. Things that are genuinely harmful in her representation of Luna. For starters, Peters chose to have her first-person protagonist not be Luna, but her sister. So while we see a lot of Luna's struggles with being trans, we see a lot more of Reagan struggling to accept her. We see so much back and forth in the names and pronouns Reagan uses to refer to Luna, which, since she's closeted, I understand she would have to switch name and pronouns around other people. But even when they're alone or she's internal monologuing, most of the time she refers to Luna by the name she did not choose and the pronouns she did not want. The only times Reagan refers to her sister as Luna is in the middle of the night when Luna is in her room playing dress up. This suggests that Luna's identity is only valid when she is more female presenting. Trans women are women all the time, even when we're in boy mode or in the closet. As soon as someone comes out to you, you should be correcting your language towards said person, not just when it's obvious. Also, a trans girl playing dress up in her mother or sister's clothes when no one is around is almost a universal experience, but it also veers into the realm of stereotype. Here's a real-world example of why this sort of representation is harmful. For much of her adult life, my mom only had one gay male friend. This man lived in a 2-story home, and the entire second floor was private, dedicated to dressing up. Every inch of it was covered in gowns and tiaras and heels. And one of my mother's favorite films is Billy Elliot, which features the same trope. So when I finally came out as trans, the only frame of reference she had for that was people cross-dressing in private. Her biggest hang-up with my transition was that she didn't understand why I would have to do it publicly, wishing I would instead follow the route of her gay friend. So you see, while this stereotype is a common trans experience, if the majority of your book's trans representation centers around this kind of private, secret experience, it's going to put people into a similar situation as me and my mother, making the coming out and transition process that much harder. Since this book is told from Reagan's perspective, we can only get so close to understanding Luna's experiences. We never get to go inside her head or hear her thoughts. This is a huge misstep for trans representation, because rather than sharing what it's like to be trans, the book is about what it's like to have a trans sibling, which really falls short when it comes to representation. Like, so much of this book is Reagan complaining about how hard it is for her to have a trans sister. She gives fuck all for how hard it is for her sister to be trans. Like when Luna first decides she wants to go in public as Luna, Reagan's only thoughts are, oh god, this is so embarrassing. Why does she have to do this to me? She's ruining my reputation. Even though the bitch had no reputation to begin with. She describes her sister being trans as being a betrayal, calls her a variation of he/she, makes jokes about her Adam's apple. She says her life is just waiting for guys to change their clothes, misgendering her sister. Says Luna dressing up in public is too much of a burden for Reagan because Luna's losing her dignity. She acts like her sister is two different people depending on how she's dressed. And just so much dead naming and misgendering that it's not even funny. Another terrible trope that the sister pulls, that it's not fair for Luna to have some attractive qualities. Cis women love to say that it's not fair when a trans woman is beautiful, but that implies that they believe all trans women by default should be uglier than cis women, and that's fucked up. If you've used this expression before, get it the fuck out of your vocabulary. The sister is also just an annoying-ass character in her own right. She has no friends, total loner, and her entire experience is taken up by worrying about her sister's bullshit. Like when she falls for this guy in her chemistry class who is totally into her, she spends the whole time moping and saying shit like, I skittered down the hall like the spineless chicken I am and always will be because I'm such a coward and disgust myself for being so scared of everything and everyone. Like, what the fuck, child? Please take it down several notches. I know this is new and scary for you, but it's okay. It turns out fine for you in the end, so please dial back this self-hate. When your entire personality is just hate for yourself and hate for your sister and hate for everybody else, what are you but just a shell of a person living in hate? Reagan was an abysmal character, and I hated being stuck in her head this whole book. Luna's best friend Allie was also really problematic. When she finally came out to her, Allie's response was, I thought he was gay. I thought he was going to tell me he had AIDS. Just because someone is gay does not mean they have AIDS, Allie! What the fuck? It must have been 2004 because that homophobia is rampant. Later, Reagan says, Allie looked at me as if her best friend had died, which I suppose he had. This is yet another very common and very problematic trope. Your friend did not die. Your perception of them shifted. You don't need to mourn anybody because they're still right fucking there. I can't tell you how pervasive this mindset is. I feel like I was lucky because I was prepared when my mom said this to me. Before I came out, I watched the Chaz Bono Becoming Chaz documentary, where Cher states the exact same thing, that she had to mourn her daughter before she could accept her son. Since I idolized Cher, I was able to internalize that and prepare myself for when my parents would eventually say it. So I feel like that softened the blow. This language and this attitude is terribly toxic and needs to be extinguished. The parents in Luna are a case study of what not to do if you have a trans child. They're both awful. The dad is just one of those straight up, I'm not gonna have a faggot living in my house. If you walk out that door, never come back. That bullshit. And the mom is just as bad. Her reaction to Luna coming out is, I can't deal with this today, and just walking off. And then we find out this mom, her bitch ass mother, knew Luna was trans the whole fucking time. She knew and did nothing. She said nothing. She didn't bother to prepare her husband for this eventuality. She never provided Luna any support in her transition. She knew and just pretended that she didn't. Fuck this mom. Fuck this dad. Fuck the sister. Fuck the whole lot of them. There are also some incredibly triggering scenes in this book that Peters, being a cis writer, did not handle well. First off is the suicide attempt. I never trust a cis author to write about trans death well, and this is the perfect example. This scene actively harms trans readers without providing any support or comfort or understanding that would come from a lived experience. Then the worst fucking part of that scene is when she doesn't go through with it, and she feels like she's such a failure that she can't even kill herself right. Had it been a trans woman writing this scene, these exact words, well, I don't know if a trans woman would write this scene in this way to begin with, but if she had, at least there would be this mutual understanding that she'd gone through this same shit, that we're going through this together. But coming from a cis author, it feels like a freak show, which is even a word Peters herself uses to describe Luna. This character is just a circus act for readers to gawk at, not sympathize with. And she's profiting off of bastardizing our pain and our struggles. That is not okay. The absolute worst scene in this book comes very close to the end, when we discover how Luna's mom found out that she had a little trans girl. When Reagan was 5, which would make Luna 7, they went to a friend's house and were in the pool. For some reason, Reagan and the other girl took off their swimsuits. Was this a thing for other people? Naked playdates? The mom's literally sitting there like, go right ahead. Wild. Anyway, the girls strip naked, and then there's Luna as a little kid, realizing for the first time that her downstairs doesn't look like the other girls. So she strips too and tries to pull off her penis. The moms mistake this gesture for something vulgar and punish her for it, sending her inside. Then, while Luna is unsupervised in the house, she finds a knife and tries to cut her fucking dick off. Look, I know the trans experience is not a monolith. We are all unique individuals with our own experiences. However, I've spoken to hundreds of trans people in my lifetime, and never has one of them done what was described in this scene. This is not real. It's just enforcing another really harmful stereotype that trans people are just obsessed with changing their genitals. There are so many trans women who have not had bottom surgery or don't even want it. Transition is so much more than our lady bits. It's social and medical and all these things. This whole scene was just disgusting. And I'm perturbed that the author would write such a thing, that that's what she thinks of us. As you can see, Luna was not good representation. Fortunately, in the nearly 20 years since then, there have been so many more books written about trans people by actual trans authors. I'd like to say that books like Luna aren't being written anymore, but unfortunately they sure are. Just last year, Laurie Frankel published a novel called This Is How It Always Is. Frankel is not trans, but she has a transgender child, so she thinks that makes her an expert on the trans perspective. This book is problematic in many of the same ways as Luna, really triggering scenes exploiting our trauma and our pain, incessant dead-naming and misgendering by the trans kid's family and narrator, and it focuses more on the family of the trans kid rather than the trans kid. I hate This Is How It Always Is way more than Luna, though. Not only is it more egregious in its bastardization of our experience, but it was written in a time where the author absolutely should have known better. In the 2020s, there is absolutely no excuse for writing something so harmful. I feel terrible for Frankel's child if this book is anything to go by. The mom really made her kid's transition all about her. I do want to take a moment and just acknowledge and appreciate Julianne Peters. It may have been a shit book, but it was the first of its kind, and that at least is worth celebrating. It's wonderful that cis authors want to write stories about trans people, but when it's telling a trans narrative when the author isn't trans, the voices are not authentic. Luna was a part of school curriculums, and it taught those children misinformation. This is why it is so important to read books written by trans authors, so you can really learn about the trans experience from their own voices. So join us for Trans Girl April and fill your reading with new perspectives. What are you planning to read for Trans Girl April? Have a trans book, good or bad, that you think I should read? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if it pleases and sparkles, I'll see you in the next video. Mwah!